This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Welcome back, everyone. It is Friday. That can only mean one thing: mail time. We're going to check out some awesome work submitted by viewers like you. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so before we get started, I do have something I want to talk to you guys about. So if you've watched this channel for a while, you know that in the past I've talked a lot about my own influences in photography. There are a wide range of them, but one in particular who I've talked about a lot is the great Richard Avedon. Some of you may remember back in 2016 when I did the artist series, one of those videos I did an interview with Laura Wilson, who was Richard Avedon's assistant for a project in particular called In the American West. In the American West has a significance to it. For one, it was done following a period of a lot of commercial work that he did, and this was a commercial photographer that was more or less moving into the fine art world. The whole impetus for this project was actually going into the West, into places like Texas, New Mexico, Utah, Montana, and actually photographing people who were not celebrities for big product ads. These were people who worked at carnivals, who worked in mines. These were like real people. It's a really interesting project, and some of you may or may not know that that actually was commissioned here in Fort Worth, Texas, where I live, at the Amon Museum. This year would have been Richard Avedon's 100th birthday, and there's a local event we do here called Photo Fest that's brought to you by Fort Worth Camera, which is my local camera store, and they've actually invited me to speak about In the American West and about Richard Avedon. I'm going to be doing this at the Amon. This was, well, it was a huge honor to be asked to do this, and so I'm really excited about it. Anyway, you can get tickets to come see this. I'll put a link in the show description. It's going to be on Saturday, May 13th. It's in the afternoon, and we're going to have a 90-minute thing, and I'm going to do a big spiel on Richard Avedon. It should be a lot of fun. So if you're interested, if you're local here in Texas, Dallas-Fort Worth area, please come check that out. But right now, let's get to some of your work. All right, so first up is this little zine. This is super funky, and I think it's really awesome. So this is called A Two-Bit World. This comes to us from Koen de Bruijn. He also includes a letter with impeccable handwriting, which reads, "Dear Ted, thank you for taking the time to read my letter. Your photo assignment videos have always inspired me to try new and creative things when it comes to photography. This was taken to the next level when I acquired a Game Boy camera in early 2021. I've spent the last 1.5 years designing a custom adapter needed to demount lenses, taking unique photographs, sorting through the images, and finally teaching myself how to make a zine. The Game Boy camera is extremely limiting, outputting 14 kilopixel images with 2-bit depth, hence the name of the zine. While the original images, but from the Game Boy camera, are monochrome, I used color palettes, or LUTs, to enhance the images in post-processing. The final product is a small, colorful zine in a unique form factor. Regards, Koen." All right, Koen, this is really well done, and I love the concept here, and something that I want to dive into a little bit. Some of you may remember, I don't know, a couple years ago I did a video basically saying why your gear doesn't matter. And it's interesting how controversial it is whenever anyone does a video like that, because people just go screaming and crying, defending the purchases that they've made over the years on expensive camera equipment. You can make things with anything you've got, and I think this proves that point entirely. So if you're not familiar, the Game Boy is capable of imaging. It's really low quality, and I've seen people do things like this before. This is a little bit different. He had to do custom adapters to get the right lens on here, but then it also outputs black and white, really lo-fi images. And so the whole idea of drawing LUTs in here and bringing colors out and experimenting with different things, it really is interesting. I mean, this, I don't think it could probably get more limiting to this, but I love the dot matrix pattern that you get in the end. It kind of reminds me of newsprint when you get real close or pull it under a magnifying glass. Of course, those pixels are round, and they're not pixels, but they're square in this case. It's a cool aesthetic, and I think this is a really nicely done zine. So, Koen, thank you for sending. Okay, next up is this book called The Marsh Speaks in Metaphor. This comes to us from Richard Eskin. Richard did not include a letter in here. However, I have emailed with him before about several things, and there's several quotes that he included at the beginning of this book from Keith Carter from my Artist Series video, and that's what we had emailed about. And this book is particularly interesting. I want to share something from the intro with you. Richard writes, "A natural sitting in an urban frame. The scenes speak to me and I interpret. Natural light, changed, manipulated to suit my mood and perception. I try to communicate in images and words. Feelings, moods, sounds, temperature, delight. Regardless of what is captured, success is seeing the result of being there. Sharing adds insight, breadth of perception, and hope that enjoyment of and compassion for the natural environment ensues, so the marsh may be preserved." He also includes 2 quotes from Keith Carter from that video that I had done. First is, "Once I figured I could change the color and make that, when it worked, evocative or make it interpretive in some way, I got very excited." The second quote is, Why don't I make some photographs or try to make some photographs about vision itself or about how I see? So one thing you might not know is that our friend Richard here is actually red-green colorblind, and it's interesting that I've had a lot of colorblind photographers send in work. This is yet another interpretation of that, which I think is extremely cool. And what he did was a technique that Keith Carter had done on some color projects where he actually would take the colors and modify them. And I love the result on this, and I think that there's a mutual admiration that Richard and I both obviously have for Mr. Keith Carter. One thing that I love about this is, first of all, the Marsh theme is very cool. It's very consistent in how it's echoed throughout. Other thing that I love about this is the monochrome tonality to these, even though they are color images. And it reminds me a lot of those early photographs that Fox Talbot took that were, I mean, there was no color photography back then, but they were toned and that they gave you kind of a monochromatic color, so to speak. And I think this is a really cool and interesting approach. Compositionally, I mean, they're landscape marshes. The ones that I really love are the ones where he's using a really shallow depth of field. It's something that's a little bit unconventional in landscape photography, and it only works when you're using a wide open aperture and you're focusing on something in the foreground to get just a little bit of that blur in the background, and you get that depth to the photograph. And I think these are really well done. Add that with the atmosphere, and I think you have something that aesthetically is really interesting. Richard goes into a lot more detail in the intro to this book, and of course I will link up to everybody. I highly recommend you guys support your fellow photographers. If you see something you like, this book is not expensive. I would definitely recommend it. Anyway, I'll put everybody's links in the show description below, so be sure to check that out. And Richard, thank you for sharing this with me. It is awesome. All right, so I've got a bunch of zines here, and I've got a really interesting book on experimental photography that was done using a Polaroid back on a Mamiya camera, but we're going to get to these. But real quick, I want to give a shout out to our awesome sponsor today, who are the great folks over at Squarespace. Listen, you need a website, and we all know how much work that is to build and maintain, but it doesn't have to be. Squarespace is by far the easiest way to build your online presence. It's also the best way to grow a business that works for you without having to write a single line of code. Do you just need a simple portfolio or a blog to showcase your work? Well, Squarespace is perfect. Featuring a drag-and-drop interface, it's intuitive, it allows you to build galleries quickly and update your site with ease. Are you running a business? Well, Squarespace gives you additional tools for things like appointment scheduling, private member areas, social media tools, and even advanced email marketing. Do you sell products or services? Well, Squarespace has you covered with complete tools to power your store, from merchandising to checkout, so that you can sell, ship, and build your customer base. You can even sell classes or manage appointments through your website. And with Squarespace extensions, you can easily sync with third parties to manage, optimize, and enhance your website. From social media integration to SEO, Squarespace gives you all the tools you need to grow a business that works for you. So head over to Squarespace and sign up for the free trial. Start with one of their award-winning templates and see what you can create and just how good you're going to look. When you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/AOP and I can save you an additional 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Just use offer code AOP on checkout. So give it a try and see if Squarespace is right for you. And I want to give a special shout out and thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. All right, so next up we've got 3 zines that come to us from a gentleman named Chad Meyer. First one is called Every Day After So Much Before So Much, which is a set of images that were taken in New York City on May 7th, 2020. Then there's We Are Nowhere Ever Volume 1, followed by We Are Never Volume 2. So if we start with Every Day After So Much Before So Much, I've seen a lot of zines that center around New York City as their subject, and I think this one's kind of unique. It's really interesting. I mean, it's more or less street photography, but I think it goes further than just giving it a label like that. I mean, there's a lot of interest that he has in here that when you go through the way the layout is, the way the images are juxtaposed, the sense of scale that plays against one another, I think is all very well done. I also like the full bleed images in here that kind of take away the image's composition and kind of leave you, because you lose the edges for the full bleed, into just kind of an observation of New York. And I think the subject matter usually dictates that, which is interesting to me. These are little details. What's interesting about these is when we switch over to the We Are Nowhere Ever zines, these have a completely different take. So if we consider the first one to be more or less, an ode to a place, giving you nothing but a sense of a place, We Are Nowhere Ever tends to go in a completely different direction. So we have wide open landscapes, big skies. And Chad certainly brings the same style over, but it's really interesting to see the juxtaposition between these two types of zines, where you have one that's in an urban environment, and then you have another one that kind of suggests that it's not in an environment. I mean, of course it is, but we don't know where this is. It's just a little more open in terms of its interpretation. Anyway, these are really well done. I love the sense of negative space that Chad uses in these. Those big skies really help pull objects out, and I think it's really cool. You don't have any of the clutter that we have in a place like New York City, where everything seems to be filled with advertising or something. And anyway, these just have a really cool feel to them. In the We Are Nowhere Ever Volume 2, he takes it even more experimental direction, where we start having collages, a lot of things with multiple exposures, images that lay on top of one another. Certainly Photoshop, but I think this is really cool, and it definitely gives a nice feel to it, and it's just something that's unusual. It's very different. One thing to notice, too, is that when Chad uses this technique, there's always a high degree of contrast. It's either opposing colors, it's opposing light. It's really interesting. I love this one of the forest images that are overlaid on top of this open sky. I think the birds, or the geese in here, are obviously part of the open sky, but all of a sudden it puts them in a different context. So again, playing with that idea of isolation or not being in a particular place. So Chad, exceptional work. Thank you for sharing these with me. My only criticism on these is that I'd actually like to see more, and that's actually a good problem to have. You kind of want to see where this is going in the next direction and what the next volume and the next theme of the zine is going to be. Anyway, these are awesome. I will link to these in the show description below. I love the way they're printed. He uses different paper types on these, but it's consistency of size and format, which I actually really like. And yeah, the printing quality on these is outstanding. So awesome work, man. Thanks for sharing. All right, so next up is this book, which is called Seasons, Emotional Landscapes. This is from a Polish photographer, and I'm going to attempt my Polish pronunciation. This is from Łukasz. Likus. Łukasz is from Whoosh, and he also includes this little letter, which reads, "Hi Ted, first of all, thank you for your channel. I'm sending you the photo book that I managed to self-publish this year. My budget only allowed for a small run of 30 copies, so the quality is not what I would call satisfactory, but I hope that you will find it acceptable. The photo book that you hold in your hand represents some of the images from one of the series that I have been working on probably since the beginning of my photographic journey. It started somewhat unconsciously, but crystallized along the way. I started digital, but gradually moved towards analog and ended up with Polaroids as one of my favorite formats. Unlike the majority of photographers, I guess, I wasn't looking for more details, more sharpness, or better contrast. To me, photography is more of a suggestion for the viewer. So a hint of what they can find on their own, explanation or idea of what they see. Instant photography offers just what I was looking for. The blurriness, the lack of detail, the weird and unpredictable results. You could say to some extent it lives its own life. Having said all of the above, I hope that now you will look at my book and somehow it makes sense. Thanks and take care, Łukasz." So Łukasz, a couple notes about this book. First of all, congratulations. It's very beautifully printed. It's very well done, and I actually really love the concept. I love the whole idea of emotional landscapes, and I think that your choice of medium with Polaroid definitely plays on that. I mean, you've got the softness of the images. You've got kind of a lot of grain going on with some of them. Some of the exposures are often few, and it does create that dreamlike emotional landscape, so to speak. And I think your approach to photography is very interesting too. I like the idea of considering the landscape with these, because these are definitely not traditional landscapes in the sense that you would see mountains or fields or bodies of water. They're tightly composed. You have a lot of things with plants, with leaves, with flowers blooming. My favorite images, and I think the direction that is really strong in this book, is the ones where you have human beings in these. And you're combining these ideas of a portrait and a landscape, but the person in the portrait is definitely blurred off and in the background. And in some of these, they're so blurry that you just make out the sense that there's a human being back there. And I think what fascinates me about this is because a lot of times in abstraction, you start to lose a sense of things. But there's something about the quality of the human form, the human figure, where you actually, or at least I do, I can tell it's somebody back there, even though the face is completely blurred out. You can kind of tell there's arms or it's a body. Anyway, I think that's really interesting, and combining these ideas into something that is very dreamlike in that sense. I think that's some of the strongest work that's in here. I think there's a lot of stuff where the black and whites, I just don't have that depth with, and I don't see it sometimes in just the garden photos. But when you combine those elements together, I think your work takes on a really strong persona, and I would definitely stay in that direction. Now, another comment I want to make on here, and this is a little bit nitpicky, but I want to talk about the layout on here. And I think it's interesting that all the photos on each spread appear on the right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, you've got this black background with a bunch of typography on it. And I like the idea of using quotes. I personally think that having a different quote with each image is just a little bit much. Sometimes it's like kind of like we're going through and it's like, okay, I get it. It's okay to let these things breathe. The typography is really big and you're pulling words out of here, and it may be just me, I just really don't understand where you're going with this. But I really do like the direction of the vibe that you're going for. I think the Polaroids are an awesome way of achieving that. And the book is really nicely printed and nicely done. And I know what it's like when you're putting money into something, you can only afford to do so many of them. But my advice would be to just keep going. I mean, just like, keep practicing, keep experimenting with your photography, go in that direction I was talking about where you're combining people into these images. I think that's really strong. And, go for it. And I want to see what the next book is. So this is a great start. Anyway, Łukasz, thank you for sharing. You should be very proud of this. I'm being nitpicky with the type, but I just think it's worth something pointing out. Anyway, awesome book. Thank you for sharing. And as I've said, I will link up to this book and everybody else down in the show description. Please help support these people. They are your colleagues. They're making awesome work and they're sharing it with the world. If you have any questions, drop them below in the comments and I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.